Hey everybody, I'm Jamie Poisson. Over the weekend, after a massive public campaign, protests, and a scathing court order calling his detention a lust for unbridled power, a 5-year-old boy named Liam Ramos was released from Texas's notorious Dilley detention facility and flown home with his father to Minneapolis. Liam had made global headlines a week earlier after claims the preschooler was used as bait on the doorstep of his home to arrest his parents. You might remember the pictures of him in his bright blue bunny hat and plaid jacket, surrounded by ICE officers. That facility where Liam was being held, Dilley, or the South Texas Family Detention Center, is where most kids end up. It's plagued with reports of poor conditions.
ICE has halted all movement at the Dilley Detention Center because of a measles outbreak.
Food contaminated with worms and mold, limited access to clean drinking water, inadequate medical care.
Around 73,000 people are being held in ICE facilities like that one across the United States right now. That is a 75% increase from right before Donald Trump took office. At least 38 people have died in ICE custody since then. It's all part of the Trump administration's rapidly expanding immigration crackdown, which has included the addition of over 100 new facilities. One of those facilities has been dubbed Alligator Alcatraz. It's in South Florida, and in December, Amnesty International USA detailed conditions there, finding they amounted to, quote, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. So to learn more about what happens when people are detained by ICE and what, if anything, courts and lawmakers can do about it, I'm talking to Amy Fisher, Director for Refugee and Migrant Rights at Amnesty International USA. Amy, hi. Thank you so much for making the time.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Let's start with what navigating the system looks like at the individual level. When people are taken by ICE, like off the street, what does the next day or so look like for them?
So when people are initially arrested by ICE, they oftentimes go first to a local processing center that prior to this administration, people would not be detained there for longer than 12 hours at a time while they can be briefly processed before being transferred to another type of detention facility. But what we are seeing more and more often now is those processing facilities being used actually as detention facilities themselves, despite the fact that they're not actually suited to detain people for prolonged periods of time. So more often than not, what this arrest process now looks like is you're arrested, you're placed in this processing center where you don't have access to attorneys, you don't have access to a bed, to medical care, to adequate food, water, and you're detained there for days at a time before then being transferred to another type of detention facility. And because the U.S. detention system is so big and so vast, people can be detained literally anywhere across the country. Many of the people that have been detained out of Minnesota have been quickly shipped down to detention facilities in Texas. People are not necessarily detained near where they are from. They are detained wherever the administration decides to put them.
And I mean, I know you have a right to access your lawyer or consulate officials from their country of origin right away, right? And just tell me more about what you're actually seeing happening there.
So you're right. There is supposed to be a right for people to be able to communicate with their attorneys, to be able to communicate with their consulates, but more often than not, ICE is really working to block that access. One example of this that we've been seeing is the way that ICE will repeatedly transfer people across various facilities in order for them to avoid access to courts or to their attorneys. And I think one of the things that's really important to say is that people don't understand that people in immigration court don't have the same access to attorneys as people do that are maybe facing criminal charges in a criminal court. There are no public attorneys that are meant to or funded to represent people in immigration court. And really what is the result of this is that many people actually will never have the chance to speak to an attorney before they are detained or removed. And those that have the luck to be able to have an attorney, those attorneys are consistently facing barriers to be able to actually speak with their clients.
I talked a little bit about Dilley, or the South Texas Family Detention Center, in the intro there. Can you just tell me more about what happens to kids that are taken into ICE custody?
Right now, the United States only has one facility, which is the Dilley Family Residential Center, where families are detained together. I have been inside of Dilley, and there is nothing about that facility that makes it appropriate for children. We oftentimes colloquially refer to it as the baby jail, because you know it very much looks and acts like a jail, except for the fact that it has children with their parents in it. They don't have access to play. Kiddos are oftentimes losing weight and regressing in their development because of the poor treatment, the poor access to water and nutritious foods, and the fact that it's really traumatizing for children to be incarcerated as kids. And so many families that are detained are sent there. But one of the other things that we have been tracking is that actually also when families are detained, sometimes they are held in hotels all across the country before being deported directly from hotels. And, we're also very much monitoring this administration's interest in expanding family detention and expanding the practice to other facilities in addition to Dilley. And so, unfortunately, what we saw with the case of Liam was horrific, but it also is very representative of something that is happening across the country, of children being detained alongside their families.
Yeah, because of course there was just so much attention put on little Liam. Obviously, Congress people and like lawyers and school boards aren't getting involved in every single case. That the Globe and Mail was a newspaper here was reporting that there are 6 Canadian children that have actually been detained by ICE and are in this system. 207 Canadians total. You mentioned that you have visited Dilley, but you've visited other centers too, right? A processing center in El Paso, Texas, and the Chrome Detention Facility in southern Florida. And can you describe the types of things that you saw there?
Amnesty International visited the El Paso Processing Center earlier last year, and what we found was maltreatment. We heard reports of people being abused by the guards. We spoke with a woman who was pregnant that wasn't getting adequate nutrition, and reports of overuse of solitary confinement, lack of access to counsel. And when we then later in the year went to the Chrome facility that is in Miami, Florida, what we saw was, if possible, even worse. We went through a medical facility where we saw, dirt on the floor. We saw people despondent. We saw people screaming at us for help to be out. We saw people in overcrowded tent facilities. And one of the things that really sticks with me from our visit to the Chrome facility was we were touring the area where they hold people in solitary confinement. And a man from Brazil held up a sign saying he was in hunger strike. And I bent down to be able to communicate with him in a slot in the metal door where they pass the food in and out. And he pushed his hand through this metal flap and said that he was on hunger strike because his hand was injured. I saw it. It was bruised. It was mangled. And he said he had been requesting medical care for 37 days without a response and had been on hunger strike as a way to protest the fact that he was being denied medical care for over a month. And as we were speaking with this individual, one of the ICE agents that was with us, that was giving us the tour of the facility, slammed this metal flap onto the already injured hand and then repeatedly punched the door multiple times in front of us. And so it was one of those things where if an ICE agent is willing to show that level of abuse and that level of cruelty, we can only imagine about what is happening when human rights monitors aren't there to keep an eye. And we really have seen the consequences of that as we are consistently receiving reports of abuse, of deaths in detention, and real deteriorating conditions across the system as a whole.
There's also this thing at the Alligator Alcatraz facility called the box, I think. What is that? Can you tell me about that?
So while we were in Florida and getting access to the Chrome facility, Amnesty also spoke with a number of people who had been previously detained in Alligator Alcatraz, as well as attorneys and advocates and family members that had loved ones either inside or previously inside. And what was repeatedly described to us was something called the box in Alligator Alcatraz, which was described to us as a 2-by-2-foot cage, similar to the type of cage that you would put a zoo animal in or an animal in at the circus. And people are placed there in the hot Florida sun. Their hands and their feet are shackled to the ground, and they are put in that box as a form of punishment for prolonged periods of time without food and without water. Amnesty has made the determination that the act of putting someone in the box amounts to torture under international law.
These are all very disturbing details. I understand that visits from organizations like yours, as well as members of Congress, and of course, immigration lawyers, are meant to be a regular part of the oversight process in immigration detention. Worth mentioning too, an investigation from the Project on Government Oversight found official ICE inspections themselves are also way down. But how difficult has it been for Amnesty and others like you to get access to these facilities? Obviously, you're getting some, but
Right. So Amnesty has made requests since January of 2025 to be able to access dozens of detention centers across the United States. We have been requesting access through what is called their NGO directive, which is supposed to allow non-governmental organizations like Amnesty and other human rights monitors access to facilities to do these types of inspections. Of the dozens of requests that we have made, we have been granted access to only those 2 facilities, Chrome and El Paso. In addition, U.S. law allows for members of Congress to be able to do unannounced inspections of ICE facilities, and members of Congress that have tried to use their oversight authority to gain access to detention facilities unannounced have been repeatedly denied that access. ICE even at times claiming that members of Congress trying to perform their oversight duties are doing things like trying to break into ICE facilities. And for years upon years, the existing oversight and compliance mechanisms to root out systemic issues in immigration detention have failed. So there have been many internal oversight reports done about consistent issues at immigration detention center, and ICE's own watchdogs have found time and time again that those mechanisms are failing to actually root out the longstanding issues, that ICE is not actually rectifying these longstanding issues, and that especially what we have seen in the Trump administration is a real attempt to block any type of oversight or looking into what is happening in the facilities.
You mentioned deaths. In 2025, 32 people died, deadliest year since 2004. 6 more have died since then. I think one of those deaths about a month ago was a Cuban immigrant named Geraldo Lunas Campos, who died of asphyxiation at Camp East Montana, right? A tent facility outside an army base near El Paso, Texas, after guards held him down. And that was actually ruled a murder. Am I right there?
Yes, interestingly, when this individual died, ICE initially reported it as a suicide. And the medical examiner, after the fact, ruled it as a homicide and saying that this individual had actually been strangled. And not only did ICE attempt to lie about the cause of death, they also tried to deport the witnesses that had seen the strangulation. And so again, this is just another example of the abuse and the attempts of covering up. And I think that is actually one of the first times we have ever seen a death in ICE custody ruled as a homicide due to abuse by those working inside the facility.
The administration, of course, denies all of these allegations of abuse, of torture, of cruelty, inhumanity. They say that these facilities come with proper meals and medical treatment, and that there are opportunities to communicate with lawyers and their family members, and that they're safe and secure, et cetera. Obviously, this runs counter to your reports and the reports of many others. I've heard this notion or this argument that the reason for some of these really harsh and inhumane conditions and long detentions and disappearing is so that people feel compelled to self-deport. It's something an immigration attorney in the Miami Herald claims, that it's like a game of chicken to see who's going to blink first. Have you seen or heard anything that would support that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one thing when you go inside of these detention centers, whether it be the Chrome facility, the El Paso facility, it's something that we have heard is common across detention centers across the country, is that the walls of these facilities on the inside are covered with posters encouraging people to self-deport. And we hear regularly reports of people being forced to sign their deportations, being tricked to sign their deportations. And so much of what this administration has been doing in their messaging, both for those that are detained and those that are not detained, has been encouraging people to self-deport, of making the experience of being an immigrant in the United States so hard, so terrible that they decide to give up their rights and leave. And it's the same thing inside of detention.
People in our country illegally can self-deport the easy way, or they can get deported the hard way, and that's not pleasant.
The Homeland Security Department is increasing the financial incentive for undocumented migrants who voluntarily leave the U.S. Officials say they will now offer a $3,000 so-called exit bonus to those who self-deport from the U.S. by the end of 2025. DHS says that since January, 1.9 million undocumented immigrants have voluntarily left the U.S. CBS News Homeland.
They want to make the conditions as cruel, as inhumane, as torturous as possible so that people feel like the only way for them to be free of these extraordinarily cruel conditions is for them to accept their own deportations and and leave that way. I think the message from this administration has been quite clear of they're forcing people to suffer with the hopes that they will give up their rights and self-deport rather than actually pursuing their legal right to stay in the United States.
This expansion of detention, I know obviously the people who they're detaining has really expanded a lot. I saw this one report from the American Immigration Council that mentioned the percentage of people arrested and detained by ICE with no criminal record went from 6 to 41% from last January to December. So obviously they need places to put all of these people.
Well, I think we'd like to see them in many states, really, many states. This one, I know Ron's doing a second one, at least a second one, and probably a couple of more. And, at some point they might morph into a system where you're going to keep it for a long time. It's not that far away.
And I've seen reporting that suggested around 100 new facilities have been used for immigration detention in the past year. And what are some of the different kind of facilities that we're seeing now, and how have you seen them expand?
Congress appropriated ICE tens of billions of dollars to expand immigration detention, and we have more people detained today than we have ever in the history of the United States. And this administration has expanded detention through a handful of different ways. We've seen the expansion of contracts with local and state police officials so that they can increasingly use state and local jails to detain people. We've seen these new models of detention facilities like Alligator Alcatraz that are co-operated between states and the federal government. So we have Alligator Alcatraz, we have Deportation Depot. We've seen the expansion of detention into military bases, like the situation at Camp East Montana.
Now, in a detailed news release, the group summarized alleged horrific conditions, including beatings and sexual abuse by officers against detained immigrants.
The El Paso Medical Examiner's Office has ruled the death of a Cuban migrant at Camp East Montana as a homicide.
And we have also seen the expansion of detention into facilities that had previously been shuttered due to abuse. So there is a facility in California that had previously been shut down due to a long history of sexual abuse within the facility. There is a facility in Georgia that had been shut down by the Biden administration due to reports of medical abuse, where women detained inside were given non-consensual and non-medically necessary operations. And that facility has also been reopened. And so I think there has been a massive effort by this administration to try and use all available spaces that they have, and also expand using tent facilities. And there have been recent reports about this administration buying up warehouses in order to put people in warehouses in order to expand detention.
The Post cited an apparent ICE document as describing this as setting a feeder system where newly arrested detainees would be booked into processing sites before being funneled into one of the 7 large-scale warehouses that hold up to 10,000 people each. Detainees would then be staged for deportation.
The Department of Homeland Security and ICE are listed on county records as buying this warehouse in Surprise last week for $70 million. The 418,000 square foot building amounts to the size of 7 football fields.
The Jim Pattison conglomerate has had a change of heart. It announced the sale of a warehouse in Virginia to ICE will not go through.
There really has been this massive effort to be able to expand the number of people that are detained without actually making sure that these facilities are appropriate for civil detention or have the protections needed to protect the safety and the rights of those inside.
A lot of the objections to all of this are coming through the courts. On January 28th, a federal judge issued a temporary restraining order preventing ICE from arresting lawfully settled refugees in Minnesota and demanding the release of all detained refugees in Minnesota and those taken to Texas within 5 days. And what is currently happening in the courts to try and check this, right?
There have been numerous court decisions to try and rein in ICE. I think the refugee one that you mentioned, there have been court decisions in Chicago and Washington, D.C. to try and rein in the warrantless arrests that are happening. And unfortunately, what we are seeing is that ICE is repeatedly ignoring court orders. There was a decision from a federal judge in Minnesota who, in his court order, attached a list of dozens upon dozens of other court orders that had been ignored by the Trump administration. And so I think what we're seeing is that the courts and the judges, being both judges that were, appointed by Democratic and Republican presidents, are trying to rein in the lawless behavior of ICE and Border Patrol, and that those attempts to rein in these agencies are oftentimes being ignored. It really is a battle, and why we really see in the United States that the use of ICE and the use of Border Patrol is really a tool of this administration's slide into authoritarian practices, is that they sort of have this lawless enforcement agency that is acting at the whim of, the White House and agency officials, and has no qualms with ignoring court orders.
Another potential check here is Congress, I guess, although they have not been particularly strong on anything. But what are we seeing from them on this front?
I think last week, for the first time, we actually saw the Senate respond to the calls of their constituents by blocking a funding bill that would have given additional funds to ICE. And we are in this position right now where there's basically a 2-week Band-Aid placed on funding the Department of Homeland Security as there are renegotiations on funding. And importantly, what we have seen time and time again is that this administration is ignoring the laws that Congress sets for them. But Congress in the U.S. does have the power of the purse. They get to decide whether or not this agency is funded. And so what Amnesty is pushing, and what many of our partners across the movement are pushing, is for ICE to be defunded, that this is an agency that has been equipped with tens of billions of dollars, and we're seeing the way that is being used to terrorize communities, to detain people, to violate the law. And so Congress really has this opportunity to not only rein in the funding by making it such that they don't have the tools that they need, but also using this moment with the funding bill to pass policies to make it such that this lawless agency can actually be reined in and stop the lawless behavior, stop arresting people without warrants, stop breaking into people's homes, stop arresting people in masks, and to pull out of our cities, to get their agents out of places like Minneapolis and Chicago and Washington, D.C. and Maine, where they are doing these hyper-violent takeovers of certain cities in the U.S.
Amy, thank you so much for this.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. That's all for today. I'm Jamie Poisson. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you tomorrow.